The wind howled through the trees, their branches groaning under the weight of a storm that had yet to break. The dense forest, which surrounded the grand hunting reserve, held an unnerving silence in the midst of it all. The rustling of leaves was the only sound, the wind whispering a warning through the thick canopy of ancient trees. Beneath that veil of quiet, a singular figure moved in the distance, his outline barely visible in the dim light of twilight. Lord Aldrich stood on the edge of his vast hunting grounds, his cloak whipping behind him like a shadow, a figure of solitude and menace. His sharp eyes scanned the horizon, fixating on the small structure near the center of the reserve. A cage. Inside, a man, a prisoner, a defiant soul who had crossed him. The man had once been a powerful lord in his own right, but now, he was reduced to little more than a broken, trembling shell. Aldrich's lips curled into a smile, cold and calculating, but his hands betrayed him, they shook, just slightly. His eyes, though, remained steely, fixed on the man who would soon learn what it meant to defy a noble of his stature. The prisoner, a former nobleman named Lucien, had dared to stand against Aldrich's growing power, to challenge his rule in ways that no one had done before. In his youth, Lucien had been a charismatic leader, a peer to Aldrich, but time had eroded both men's kindness. The nobleman's tyranny had grown slowly, insidiously, but Lucien, a man driven by his own ideals, had refused to bow. His fate was sealed when he made the mistake of opposing Aldrich publicly. And now, he paid the price. Aldrich had locked Lucien in the cage within the very heart of his hunting grounds, a vast reserve of dangerous wildlife, both native and foreign. Wolves, lynxes, wild boar, even bears roamed freely within these boundaries, a testament to Aldrich's wealth and his obsession with dominion. No creature, human or animal, could survive the night unscathed within these walls. It was Aldrich's cruel attempt to teach Lucien the consequences of rebellion, to show him the might of the nobleman's will. But tonight, the beasts would not obey. And neither would Lucien. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding. A mist began to curl around the ground, seeping through the underbrush as the last remnants of sunlight began to fade. Aldrich watched as Lucien paced back and forth in the cage, his gaunt face hollow with exhaustion, his eyes darting around nervously as the distant sounds of the forest grew louder. The crackling of branches underfoot, the growl of unseen creatures, the rustling of the undergrowth, it was all part of the trap. The beastly sounds were meant to break him, to send him into a frenzy of fear, to show him the depths of his helplessness. Lucien, however, seemed eerily composed. His face was etched with grim determination, but there was no visible panic in his movements. His gaze locked onto Aldrich, their eyes meeting across the distance, and for a moment, there was something unsettling in that look, something that made Aldrich's confidence falter, just for an instant. Lucien knew something Aldrich did not. Something that threatened the foundation of everything Aldrich thought he understood. In the distance, the first howl of a wolf shattered the silence. It was distant at first, but it quickly grew closer, the sound carrying over the wind. Aldrich stood motionless, watching. Soon, the sound of other beasts joined in, the screech of a lynx, the heavy steps of a bear, and the occasional roar of a wild boar charging through the woods. The storm had not yet arrived, but nature was already beginning to stir. The animals were restless. "Let them come," Aldrich muttered under his breath. He took a step forward, his boots crunching on the frozen earth as he slowly advanced. He was the master of this land. He had tamed it, conquered it, and made it his. No wild creature, not even the most ferocious beast, could disobey him. His mind, sharp and unwavering, believed this with every ounce of his being. The forest, the beasts, the prisoner, all would bow before his might. It was only a matter of time. Yet, as he reached the edge of the cage, his eyes never left Lucien's face. The prisoner did not look terrified. Instead, Lucien's eyes seemed to gleam with a kind of quiet defiance, a glimmer of something Aldrich could not quite name. It unsettled him, more than he cared to admit. "Do you think you can control them?" Lucien's voice rang out, unexpectedly clear in the midst of the howling wind. There was no trace of fear in his tone, no sign of desperation, only a cold certainty. You think the beasts will obey you. You think this is some test, a game you can win. But you are wrong. You are not their master. They will never listen to you. Aldrich's fingers twitched, his hands tightening into fists. The words struck him harder than they should have. But he couldn't let his emotions show. Not here. Not now. His eyes hardened, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. I am their master, he said, his voice low but firm. I control them. I command them. And by morning, you will have learned just how foolish you are to challenge me. He turned away and gave a sharp command to his soldiers, who had been standing at the ready at a distance, waiting for his signal. Release them. A moment of tension passed. The soldiers, grim-faced and obedient, unlocked the gates that separated the beasts from the prisoner. One by one, the animals were released, their eyes gleaming with hunger and wild anticipation. They had been trained, tamed, but in these woods, they were still creatures of instinct. Aldrich believed that the sight of him would keep them in line, that they would obey his presence as they always had. The first wolf slinked from the underbrush, its eyes glowing in the fading light. It was quickly followed by a larger, more menacing bear. The wolves circled the cage, their growls rising in a slow, eerie chorus. The air was thick with the scent of their breath, the noise of their claws scraping against the earth. Lucien stood motionless, but his eyes never left Aldrich. There was no panic. No fear. Just the flicker of something deeper, something that stirred unease in the heart of the nobleman. The night wore on, and the tension between the two men thickened. Aldrich stood unmoving, watching as the beasts encircled the cage, their hunger palpable. He could hear their growls, their snarls, but what disturbed him most was the unnatural silence that had settled between the beastly sounds. The animals were not acting as they should. They were not attacking. Instead, they seemed to be waiting, circling in a manner that made no sense. The primal instincts he had counted on seemed muted, as though something was holding them back. For a moment, Aldrich's confidence wavered, but he quickly dismissed the thought. He was their master. He could control them. He must. As the wind picked up, the howl of a distant wolf pierced the air. The rest of the pack followed, their voices mingling in an eerie symphony of madness. But something was different. The wolves weren't responding to Aldrich's commands. They were behaving as if they had a mind of their own, a mind that refused to acknowledge him. Aldrich's hand twitched. The animals were no longer under his command. Something was wrong. The beasts had turned against him. The prisoner's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. And then, Lucien spoke again, his voice barely a whisper in the gathering darkness. By morning, none will obey you. The estate that Lord Aldrich ruled over was vast, stretching for miles through rolling hills, dense woodlands, and craggy cliffs that dropped sharply to the river below. It was a place of both beauty and menace, a contradiction in every sense. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, the sun almost never fully able to pierce the layers of thick foliage that covered the forest floor. Towering trees formed an endless canopy, casting long, shifting shadows that moved like specters over the land. It was a place where nature thrived unchecked, wild and untamed, and yet Lord Aldrich, with his towering ambition and relentless hunger for power, had bent it to his will. The estate, known as Ilverwick, had been in Aldrich's family for generations. It was the seat of his noble lineage, a sprawling fortress that had withstood the ravages of time, war, and politics. Yet beneath its stately grandeur, something sinister had always lurked. The stone walls of the estate were lined with portraits of past generations, men and women who had ruled with a quiet, calculated authority, never questioning the weight of their power. But in recent years, Aldrich had begun to take the family name to darker extremes. No longer satisfied with simply governing the land and the people who lived on it, he sought dominion over everything, including nature itself. Aldrich had always been a man of intense ambition, even as a young boy. The very first memories of his childhood were those of being told, time and again, that the family's wealth and influence were his to inherit. His father, a stern but fair man, had taught him the importance of control over people, control over land, and, eventually, control over everything else. His mother, a delicate, frail woman who rarely left the estate, would often warn him about the dangers of pride and arrogance. Yet, Aldrich had always been more drawn to the idea of power than to the warnings about hubris. The lessons about gentleness and humility seemed like distant whispers, drowned out by the louder, more intoxicating promises of mastery. As he grew older, Aldrich's obsession with control only deepened. He was driven by the belief that nature itself could be harnessed, its primal forces subdued under the careful hand of a ruler who was not afraid to go to any lengths to achieve his goals. It was during his early 20s, when Aldrich took full command of Ilverwick after his father's passing, that he began to change the land itself. He initiated the creation of his vast hunting reserve, a place where no animal would dare enter without being watched, where he could test his theories on dominance. The reserve, like everything else Aldrich touched, became a monument to his power. It was not simply a hunting ground, but a show of force, an elaborate stage where Aldrich could demonstrate his control over the creatures of the wild. Wolves, lynxes, wild boar, and even the occasional bear were carefully selected and brought to the reserve, their movements monitored, their lives controlled. Aldrich watched from afar, pleased by the sight of the beasts caged and obedient. They were a symbol of his power, tamed, subdued, like everything else in his world. But in his heart, Aldrich knew that there was something more. Something darker. He began to believe that the reserve, the creatures within it, and the land itself could be made to obey him not just through dominance, but through fear. The wild was not to be controlled merely by force, it needed to be broken, humbled, brought to heel through the threat of utter annihilation. And so, over the years, Aldrich refined his methods, constructing a labyrinth of traps and enclosures, making sure that the beasts could never escape, never defy him. It was not just animals he sought to dominate, however. The people who lived in the village surrounding Ilverwick were also subject to Aldrich's increasing authoritarian rule. At first, the villagers had accepted his dominance with little protest, for they had grown up in the shadow of the estate and its mighty lord. But as Aldrich's cruelty deepened, so did their discomfort. The small gestures of defiance, a glance, a whisper, a refusal to bow low enough, began to surface. People started to speak in hushed tones about the changes in Aldrich's behavior, about the rumors of strange rituals performed deep in the woods, about the whispers that came from the trees themselves. Despite these growing fears, Aldrich's power remained unchallenged. His soldiers were loyal, and the villagers, though frightened, remained compliant. Fear was a powerful tool. And Aldrich wielded it like a master. But it was not just fear that shaped Aldrich's worldview. There was an underlying belief, a philosophy he had nurtured since his youth, that nature itself was a force to be conquered. He saw himself as a god of sorts, standing above all that was mortal. While other men had used religion or philosophy as their means of control, Aldrich turned to something more primal, more absolute, the belief that the world could be reshaped to suit his will. If the animals could be broken, so too could the land, the people, and even the very forces of life and death itself. It was in his early 30s that Aldrich began to fully realize the magnitude of his ambition. By this time, the hunting reserve had become more than just a collection of wild animals. It had become a prison, a place where both man and beast were held in thrall to Aldrich's whim. The animals were kept in various enclosures, their movements studied and controlled, while the reserve itself grew into a dark, forbidding place. The trees that had once stood tall and proud were now twisted and gnarled, the paths overgrown and treacherous. The air grew thick with the scent of decay, as though the land itself was starting to rebel against its captor. Yet, it was not the animals that would ultimately bring Aldrich's downfall, nor the villagers, nor the land itself. It would be the arrival of Lucien, the prisoner, that would change everything. Lucien, a man whose ambition had once mirrored Aldrich's, had fallen from grace in a way that would set the wheels of fate into motion. He was not a man who had merely defied Aldrich out of malice or envy. No, Lucien's rebellion was born of a deep, unshakable conviction that Aldrich's methods, his tyranny, his obsession with power, were unnatural, evil, and ultimately self-destructive. Lucien's downfall had come when he had tried to rally the people to his side, to overthrow Aldrich before it was too late. But in doing so, he had fallen into Aldrich's trap, and now he stood, broken and defeated, at the mercy of the very man he had sought to destroy. But the story of Lucien's capture was only the beginning. The true horror would come when Aldrich, having trapped his former adversary in the very heart of the hunting reserve, would discover that the beasts under his control were no longer his to command. For the first time, the land itself seemed to rebel against its master, and it was here, in the shadow of his own creation, that Aldrich would begin to understand the terrible cost of his unrelenting quest for control. It was too late for repentance. Too late for reflection. The game was set, and the stakes were higher than Aldrich could have ever imagined. His once perfect world was starting to crumble, and soon, he would learn that even the most powerful men cannot control the wild forces of nature. The land surrounding Ilverwick was no ordinary stretch of wilderness. It was a place of ancient, almost primal power, a power that had existed long before Lord Aldrich set foot on the land and would endure long after he was gone. The trees in the reserve were not mere pines or oaks, but ancient sentinels that had witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms, the shifting of empires, and the slow, deliberate march of time itself. Their gnarled roots twisted deep into the earth, and their thick branches arched overhead, creating a canopy that seemed to keep the light of day at bay. The forest floor, thick with moss and ivy, seemed to breathe with a life of its own, pulsing with an eerie stillness, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. In the early days of Aldrich's reign, the reserve had been a place of recreation, a hunting ground where he could flex his power and demonstrate his control over nature. But as the years went by, the landscape itself began to shift. The once pristine hunting paths became overgrown with thick brambles, the trees seemed to grow taller and more twisted, their trunks like dark fingers reaching for the sky. The very air felt heavier, as though the land itself was suffocating under Aldrich's ambitions. Aldrich, ever the pragmatic man, saw the land as an asset, a resource to be bent to his will. He saw the animals in his reserve as little more than tools, pawns in a game that only he could control. He had carefully selected each species, ensuring that the beasts that roamed the reserve were both deadly and impressive: wolves, lynxes, wild boar, and even a few bears that he had imported from distant lands. His idea was simple: if he could tame the land and its creatures, he could prove his dominion over the forces of nature itself. It was not enough to rule over men, Aldrich wanted to rule over all living things. But in the process of trying to master the land, Aldrich had begun to twist it. The reserve, once a thing of beauty, had become something far darker. The animals were no longer simply creatures to be hunted or admired, they had become a manifestation of Aldrich's unchecked power, a reflection of his growing tyranny. The wolves that had once roamed freely in the wild were now confined to pens, their movements reduced to predictable routines, while the lynxes and boars were kept in cages so small they could hardly move. The bears, once majestic in their strength and freedom, were now little more than prisoners, pacing back and forth in the shadows of their enclosures. The forest itself had begun to react. The once dominant oaks and pines had become twisted and contorted, their bark rough and cracked, their leaves dark and sickly. It was as if the land was trying to fight back against the encroaching oppression, pushing back against the unnatural order that Aldrich had forced upon it. The balance of the ecosystem, once delicate and harmonious, had been thrown into disarray, and the land had become a reflection of the imbalance that Aldrich had introduced. The people who lived on the outskirts of the estate, the villagers who had once regarded the estate with a sense of awe, had started to notice the changes. They had always known Ilverwick to be a place of power, a place where the noble family had held sway for centuries. But now, whispers began to circulate in the village about the unnatural things happening within the reserve. The animals, they said, were no longer the same. There were reports of wolves behaving in ways they should not, of strange noises echoing through the night, of animals that seemed to grow larger and more aggressive by the day. But the villagers were too afraid to speak openly about what they had seen. They had long understood that Aldrich's power was not to be questioned. To do so would be to invite his wrath, and no one wanted to face the consequences of defying him. Still, the rumors persisted, passed from one hushed conversation to the next. Some claimed that the land itself was cursed, that it had become a place of dark magic, a place where the forces of nature were no longer in control, but were instead being manipulated by a man whose greed for power knew no bounds. Others said that the animals had become something more, that they were no longer just creatures, but something darker, something unnatural, perhaps even the embodiment of Aldrich's twisted will. Lord Aldrich, of course, saw none of this. He saw only the results of his ambitions. The hunting reserve, with its well-maintained pens and its carefully managed creatures, was a testament to his control. He had built it with his own hands, had shaped it into the perfect reflection of his power. He was proud of the reserve, proud of the way it displayed his dominance over the land and its inhabitants. But what Aldrich failed to realize was that in his attempts to dominate the natural world, he had opened a door to something far older and more powerful than he could ever comprehend. The land had begun to rebel in ways that Aldrich could not understand. The creatures that once obeyed his every command were now acting unpredictably. The wolves no longer responded to his voice or his gestures. The lynxes, once obedient to his presence, now seemed to avoid him entirely. The bears, too, began to exhibit strange behavior, charging the fences that contained them with a ferocity that Aldrich had never seen before. The reserve, once a place of rigid control, had turned into a battleground, a place where Aldrich's authority over nature was being challenged in ways he could not explain. It wasn't just the animals that seemed to have changed. The forest itself was now alive with a malevolent energy, an energy that Aldrich could feel deep in his bones. The air was thick with tension, as though the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The ground seemed to tremble with every step, the trees creaking and groaning under an unseen weight. It was as if the very fabric of the world around him was starting to unravel, and Aldrich, in his arrogance, was blind to it all. For the first time in years, Aldrich felt something that he had never experienced before: fear. It was a small, insidious thing, creeping into his thoughts like a shadow at the edge of his mind. He had always believed that fear was a tool, something that he could wield to control others, but now, it was he who was being controlled by it. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, a gnawing, insistent feeling that something was terribly wrong. But Aldrich would not acknowledge it. He refused to. He was the master of this land, the ruler of all that lay within it. He would not be undone by superstition or irrational fear. He would show the world, and himself, that he was in control. He would restore order to the reserve, tame the wild beasts once more, and prove that his power over nature was absolute. Yet, as the days passed and the strange behavior of the animals continued, Aldrich's sense of control began to slip further and further from his grasp. The wolves howled at the moon in unison, their calls echoing through the night like a death knell. The lynxes stalked the edges of the reserve, their glowing eyes watching him from the shadows. The boars charged the fences with a force that shook the ground beneath him, and the bears were no longer afraid of him. They seemed to be waiting for something that Aldrich could not comprehend. It was then that Aldrich began to hear the stories, whispers from his servants, from the villagers. They spoke of a time long ago, before the estate was built, when the land had been untouched by human hands. They spoke of old legends, of spirits that roamed the woods, of curses that could never be lifted. They spoke of a darkness that had always existed in the reserve, a darkness that no man could ever truly control. But Aldrich would not listen. He could not. He was the master of this land, and no superstition, no ancient legend, would sway him from his course. He had built this estate with his own hands, and he would not let it fall to forces he could not understand. And yet, deep in the heart of the reserve, where the trees grew thick and the animals roamed free, the land itself began to stir, as though it was awakening from a long slumber. Something was coming, something that Aldrich could never have predicted, and could not hope to control. The first sign of trouble came on an evening thick with fog, when the air itself seemed to hold its breath, suspended in time. The mist clung to the trees like ghostly fingers, and the forest around Ilverwick appeared to be shrouded in an unnatural silence. Even the ever-present whispers of the wind seemed muted, as though nature itself was waiting for something to happen. It was in this eerie stillness that the servants of the estate first noticed the change. The usual rhythm of life at Ilverwick had always been predictable, governed by the steady hand of Lord Aldrich. The servants moved in their habitual routines, preparing meals, tending to the horses, cleaning the grand halls of the manor. But that evening, as they worked near the boundary of the reserve, they began to feel the unease that had settled over the land. It was a sensation that no one could quite put into words, a feeling that something had shifted, that the balance of the world had been disturbed. At first, it was subtle. A servant, a young woman named Etta, reported hearing strange rustling sounds in the woods beyond the estate's stone walls. The noise was not the normal hum of animal life that often filled the air during the evening hours. These sounds were different. They were far too deliberate, as though something, or someone, was moving with purpose. Etta's description of the sound sent chills through the other servants, but they dismissed her concerns, attributing the noises to the usual creatures of the forest. Yet, as the evening wore on, more of the estate's workers began to notice the same unsettling occurrences. Several of the stable hands swore that they had heard the sounds of wolves, not far from the reserve's boundary, howling in a way that was far too close for comfort. Others said they had seen fleeting glimpses of shadows moving through the trees, shadows that did not belong to the familiar wildlife of the estate. It was as though something far larger and more menacing was lurking just out of sight, waiting. As the night descended, the tension in the air grew palpable. The moon hung low in the sky, its pale light barely breaking through the thick layers of fog that now covered the estate like a blanket. It was at this moment that Aldrich, as he often did on nights when the air felt thick with foreboding, took a walk through the grounds. His mind, forever fixated on the reserve and the creatures within it, sought some kind of reassurance that everything was under his control. He walked with purpose, his boots crunching on the frost-covered ground, his breath visible in the cold air. As he approached the edge of the reserve, a strange feeling washed over him, a sensation of being watched, of being followed. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and for the first time in years, Aldrich hesitated. He stopped, his sharp eyes scanning the shadowed underbrush, but there was nothing there. Just the trees. Just the wind, now whispering in his ears. He scoffed at his own unease. This was his land, his domain. There was no reason to fear the creatures of the reserve. They were his to command, his to control. Yet, despite the confidence in his mind, there was a growing knot of discomfort in his gut. Something was not right. The next morning, the unease that had settled over the estate the previous evening was still present, hanging heavy in the air. Aldrich, determined to prove that he was unaffected by the strange occurrences, gave orders to his soldiers to go deeper into the reserve and check on the creatures. It was routine, of course, but his commands were sharp, his tone carrying an edge that he couldn't entirely disguise. As the soldiers ventured into the reserve, they reported nothing out of the ordinary at first. The wolves were in their pens, the lynxes seemed calm, the boars were accounted for. But as they approached the bear enclosures, something changed. The bears, once docile and subdued, were agitated, pacing in their pens with unnatural intensity. Their growls, deep and guttural, reverberated through the thick walls of their cages, and the soldiers noted the frantic, almost desperate look in their eyes. The tension in the air seemed to build with each passing minute, and the hairs on the back of their necks stood on end, too. One of the soldiers, a grizzled veteran named Soren, approached one of the pens cautiously, his hand on the hilt of his sword. The bear inside, a massive creature with matted fur and yellowed eyes, stood still for a moment, its body tense as though it was preparing to pounce. Soren took a step closer, his breath shallow, but before he could make a move, the bear turned its head and let out a series of low, rumbling growls. There was something in the bear's eyes, something that had not been there before. Fear. Anger. No, it was something more primal, something that felt ancient, as though the bear recognized the unnaturalness of its captivity. The soldier froze, his hand instinctively tightening around the hilt of his sword. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, without warning, the bear lunged. The wooden walls of the enclosure creaked under the force of its strike, and the soldiers scrambled back in a flurry of motion. The beast's teeth snapped shut with a sickening crunch as it tried to break free of its cage. The soldiers shouted in panic, and it was only through sheer luck that they managed to subdue the bear before it could escape. But the sense of dread that followed them as they made their way back to the estate was unmistakable. This was no longer just a matter of managing the beasts. Something was wrong with the land itself. Over the next few days, the unsettling behavior of the animals in the reserve only escalated. The wolves were no longer responsive to commands, their eyes glowing with an eerie, almost intelligent malice. The lynxes, once so graceful and elusive, were now agitated, growling and clawing at their enclosures as though they were trying to escape. The boars, typically solitary creatures, moved in unnerving packs, charging at anything that moved with uncharacteristic fury. And the bears, they had become completely unpredictable, lashing out at anything that came too close, their behavior wild and erratic. At first, Aldrich refused to acknowledge the growing sense of panic that had begun to permeate the reserve. His men, shaken by the animals' behavior, tried to speak to him, but he dismissed their concerns with cold, cutting words. He was the master here. He had built this reserve, tamed these creatures, and he would not allow them to defy him. But even as he spoke, the doubt in his heart continued to grow, gnawing at him, whispering that something far more dangerous was at play. The villagers, too, had started to take notice. They spoke in hushed tones of the strange happenings in the reserve, of the beasts acting in ways they never had before. The atmosphere in the village had become thick with suspicion, and people began to avoid the reserve entirely, even if it meant taking longer routes to avoid the cursed ground. Then, one night, the first real tragedy struck. A young servant girl, who had been tasked with feeding the wolves, went missing. She had been a quiet, obedient worker, and it was unlike her to stray from her duties. When she didn't return to the manor that evening, the other servants began to worry. They searched for her through the thick fog, calling her name, but there was no answer. It wasn't until dawn, when the fog lifted, that her body was found, mauled and torn, her clothing ripped apart, her body unrecognizable. The wolves had gotten to her. The discovery sent shockwaves through the estate. Aldrich, normally a man of unflinching resolve, was shaken by the brutality of the attack. It was as if the wolves had become something else, something that no longer obeyed the rules of the reserve, something that was beyond his control. The other animals, too, seemed to respond to the killing. The lynxes, the boars, the bears, all of them were restless, more aggressive than ever before. The air was charged with a sense of unease, as though the beasts were waiting for something, as if they knew something that Aldrich did not. The servants were now terrified. They began to whisper among themselves that the reserve was cursed, that the land itself had turned against them, that the spirits of the forest were angry with the nobleman for taming it. But Aldrich would not listen to such nonsense. He could not. To do so would be to admit that he had lost control, that the power he had so carefully built was slipping through his fingers. And yet, deep down, a growing realization began to settle in his chest. No matter how tightly he gripped the reins of his world, something was slipping away. Something powerful and ancient was stirring within the reserve, something that even his might could not contain. The walls he had so carefully built around his empire, both physical and psychological, were beginning to crumble. The beasts no longer obeyed him. And as the days went on, it became clear that neither would the land itself. The villagers of Ilverwick had always lived in the shadow of Lord Aldrich's estate. They had grown accustomed to the power he wielded, to the oppressive silence that followed him wherever he went. But as the strange occurrences in the reserve began to escalate, even they could no longer ignore the feeling that something terrible was unfolding. The whispers that had once been dismissed as superstition now took root in every corner of the village, growing in volume and intensity. For generations, the people of Ilverwick had heard the stories, tales passed down from parents to children about the land itself, about the spirits that roamed the woods and the ancient forces that lived in the earth. These were stories that had always been seen as little more than folklore, tales meant to keep children in line or to explain away the unexplainable. But as the reserve grew darker, as the behavior of the animals became more erratic, those stories began to take on new meaning. The first to speak out openly was Father Dunstan, the village priest, a man whose faith had always been steadfast, if somewhat tempered by the realities of life in the shadow of the manor. For years, he had lived in peace with Lord Aldrich, knowing that the nobleman had little interest in the affairs of the church. But as the strange events grew more frequent, as the land itself seemed to rebel against its master, Father Dunstan felt a growing unease. There were things happening in the reserve that could not be explained by logic or reason, things that hinted at forces beyond human understanding. It was one evening, as he walked along the edge of the village, that he was stopped by a group of villagers who had gathered in the town square. The air was thick with tension, and the faces of those present were drawn and anxious. They spoke of the young servant girl who had been found mauled by the wolves, of the strange behavior of the animals, of the increasing number of unexplained incidents that had begun to plague the estate. Father Dunstan listened, his heart heavy with concern. He had never been one to indulge in superstition, but something in the tone of their voices made him pause. There was a conviction there that could not be ignored. The villagers spoke of a curse, of an ancient evil that had awoken in the land, and they looked to Father Dunstan for answers. But the priest, who had spent his life interpreting the Bible and offering solace to his flock, found himself at a loss. There were no scriptures that could explain what was happening at Ilverwick. There were no prayers that could undo the growing darkness that seemed to be closing in around the estate. And so, Father Dunstan did what he could. He began to hold prayer services more frequently, gathering the villagers to offer their concerns to God. But even as he did so, he could not shake the feeling that his words were hollow, that his prayers were falling on deaf ears. The people of Ilverwick were afraid, and no amount of scripture seemed to offer them the comfort they sought. Meanwhile, the atmosphere on Aldrich's estate continued to deteriorate. The strange occurrences in the reserve had become so frequent that the soldiers and servants who worked there began to speak in hushed tones of something far darker than they had imagined. They spoke of the animals growing restless, of the oppressive feeling that hung over the estate like a heavy fog. Even the air itself seemed to be different now, thick with an unnatural stillness that made their movements feel sluggish, as though they were trudging through mud. Lord Aldrich, however, remained resolute. His belief in his own power, in his control over the land, had always been unshakable. He had worked tirelessly to create a world where nothing could defy him, where the animals, the villagers, and even nature itself bowed to his will. He refused to entertain the idea that something was amiss, that his hold on the reserve was slipping. He had never believed in curses or superstition. His strength had always been enough to bend reality to his will. But that belief was beginning to crack. Aldrich had spent countless hours watching the reserve, ensuring that the animals remained under his control, but as the days wore on, it became clear that his authority was no longer absolute. The wolves, once loyal to his commands, no longer responded to his presence. The lynxes, whose behavior had once been so predictable, had grown wild and unpredictable, stalking the edges of their enclosures with eyes full of malice. The bears, once docile creatures, were now an unpredictable force of rage, clawing at their cages, desperate to escape. The boars, too, had begun to behave erratically, charging the fences and bellowing in frustration. No matter how much Aldrich tried to impose his will upon them, the animals refused to obey. At first, Aldrich had believed that the animals were simply testing him, trying to reassert their dominance in the reserve. He had always believed that fear was the most powerful tool at his disposal, that as long as the creatures feared him, they would fall in line. But now, that fear seemed to have faded, replaced by something far more dangerous, defiance. The animals, once his prisoners, were now turning on him, as though they knew that they could no longer be controlled. It was then that the whispers of the villagers grew louder. The curse of Ilverwick, they said, had come to fruition. The ancient spirits of the land had awakened, angry at the way the land had been tamed, angry at the unnatural dominion Aldrich had forced upon it. They spoke of the old gods of the forest, of the spirits that had once ruled the land before men had come to tame it. These were not the gods of Aldrich's world, they were primal, ancient forces, born of the earth itself, and they had no place in his vision of order. As the days turned into weeks, Aldrich began to notice the signs of a deeper, more profound shift in the land. The trees that once stood tall and proud now seemed to cower under the weight of an unseen force. The ground beneath his feet felt unstable, as though the earth itself was shifting, as if it were preparing to swallow him whole. The air, always thick with the scent of pine and earth, now carried a sickly sweetness, like the smell of decay. And the reserve, the once carefully managed hunting grounds that had been his pride and joy, had become a place of fear. The animals had ceased to be mere creatures of nature, they had become something more, something darker. They were no longer afraid of him. They were no longer in awe of his power. They had become agents of something older, something beyond his comprehension. At night, the sounds from the reserve became more unnerving. The howls of the wolves were no longer the familiar, distant calls that had once echoed through the trees. Now, they were frantic, desperate, as though the wolves were calling to one another in a language that no man could understand. The lynxes, too, had begun to make strange sounds, not the usual growls or hisses, but something lower, deeper, more guttural. The boars, their tusks glinting in the moonlight, would often be seen charging in circles around their enclosures, their eyes wild with a feverish madness. And the bears had become the most terrifying of all. Their growls were like distant thunder, shaking the very ground beneath Aldrich's feet. It was clear now that something was happening that Aldrich could no longer control. The animals had turned against him, but more than that, the land itself had rebelled. The spirits of the forest, the ancient powers that had once ruled the earth, had awakened, and they were angry. They were not content with being tamed, with being confined to pens and cages. They were demanding something that Aldrich had no power to give. As the days passed, the atmosphere on the estate grew more oppressive. The fog that had once rolled in from the forest now lingered around the manor, obscuring everything in its path. The walls of the estate seemed to close in on Aldrich, pressing down on him from all sides. The land, which he had once ruled with an iron fist, had become alien to him. The animals no longer obeyed him. The villagers no longer trusted him. And the land itself, the very earth beneath his feet, was turning against him. The fear that Aldrich had once instilled in others now consumed him. For the first time in years, he found himself doubting his own power. The great lord of Ilverwick was no longer the master of his domain. He was a prisoner of his own creation, trapped in a world that was slipping out of his control. The land had rebelled, and there was no longer anywhere for Aldrich to hide. The whispers of the villagers were no longer just whispers. They had become a chorus, a warning that Aldrich could no longer ignore. The curse of Ilverwick had come to pass, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The spirits of the forest had awoken, and they would not rest until the land had been freed from the shackles of man. The days that followed the servant girl's death were marked by a heavy silence that settled over Ilverwick like a pall. The once bustling estate, where the servants and soldiers moved about with practiced ease, now seemed hushed, almost reverential. The villagers, too, kept their distance, casting fearful glances at the estate and whispering in hushed tones about the growing power of the land. They no longer spoke of the occasional strange sounds in the night or the odd behavior of the animals in the reserve. The terror that had slowly crept into their lives had now become a tangible force that could not be ignored. It was no longer superstition, it was reality. Lord Aldrich, though shaken by the death of the young servant girl, refused to let fear take hold of him. He was a man who had long prided himself on his ability to control the world around him, to bend the land, the people, and even the beasts to his will. The girl's death, brutal and unexplained, was a blow to his ego more than anything else. It was an affront to his carefully constructed world, and the more he thought about it, the more he convinced himself that it was merely a freak occurrence, something beyond his control but not something that could unravel his dominion over the estate. He would deal with it, as he had dealt with all his problems in the past, with power, with intimidation, and with resolve. Yet, deep down, Aldrich could feel something more insidious stirring within him. The death had not just been the loss of a servant, it had been a reminder of the fragility of the world he had built. The animals were no longer tame, and the land seemed to resist him with every step he took. It wasn't just the death of the servant girl that gnawed at his mind, it was the sense that the earth itself, the trees, the wind, and the very fabric of nature, had turned against him. Despite the creeping dread, Aldrich continued with his daily routines. He oversaw the soldiers, ensuring that the reserve's boundaries were secure. He spent hours in his study, poring over ledgers and making plans for future hunts. Yet no matter how hard he tried to maintain his focus, his mind kept drifting back to the events in the reserve. The animals were no longer mere creatures of the wild, obedient to his command. They were becoming something else, something far more unpredictable and dangerous. The wolves, once so loyal, were now a constant threat, their eyes gleaming with an intelligence that Aldrich could not understand. The boars had become aggressive, charging the fences with reckless abandon. The lynxes, silent and elusive, had begun to move in packs, stalking the perimeter of their enclosures like predators on the hunt. And the bears, they were the worst. Their once docile nature had given way to violent outbursts, their growls echoing through the trees with an intensity that rattled even the bravest men. Aldrich had called in his head huntsman, a grizzled veteran named Balthazar, to discuss the situation. The man had been with the family for years and had helped maintain the hunting grounds with precision and skill. But even Balthazar was starting to show signs of fear. The animals, once predictable and obedient, were now unpredictable, their behavior erratic. The huntsman had come to Aldrich with his concerns, though he spoke in a guarded tone, as though afraid of angering his lord. "My lord," Balthazar began, his voice low and hesitant, "the animals are acting strange. We've seen behavior from the boars and wolves that we've never encountered before. The bears, too, have grown more violent. It's as if they're rebelling." Aldrich frowned, his hand tightening around a glass of brandy in front of him. He had always prided himself on his control over the creatures of the reserve. He had created this kingdom, had bent the wild to his will, and now, to hear Balthazar speak of rebellion was a blow to his pride. "They are animals, Balthazar," Aldrich snapped. "They are creatures of instinct, nothing more. If they are misbehaving, it's because they are being too wild, too unruly. They simply need to be reminded of who is in charge." Balthazar hesitated but then spoke again, his voice carrying a note of urgency. "It's not just that, my lord. It's something else. The land itself feels different. The air is thick with something I can't explain. The wolves, they've stopped obeying your commands. They're not responding to the usual calls. The lynxes, they move in ways that seem almost coordinated. And the boars, they're not acting like prey anymore. They're hunting." Aldrich's face darkened at this. He could not afford to show weakness, not to Balthazar, not to anyone. He had worked too hard to build his power, to let it slip away now would be to admit defeat. Yet, even as he spoke, there was a deep, gnawing fear creeping into his heart. "Enough," he said, his voice hardening. "You will go back to the reserve and deal with the animals. If they are out of line, you will put them back in their place. I will not tolerate insubordination, not from creatures, not from men." Balthazar nodded, though his eyes betrayed a hint of doubt. He left the room without another word, and Aldrich was left alone, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. The land was no longer his ally. The animals were no longer his obedient subjects. The very earth seemed to be turning against him, as though it had been awakened from a deep slumber and was now fighting back. That night, as Aldrich paced the halls of his manor, the strange sounds began once again. The howls of the wolves pierced the stillness of the night, their cries echoing through the walls of the estate. But these were not the usual calls, distant and mournful. No, these were sharp, frantic howls, filled with a sense of urgency that sent a chill through Aldrich's spine. It was as if the wolves were communicating something far more complex than the simple instincts of hunger or territory. The sound of the wolves' cries was soon joined by the guttural growls of the lynxes, their low, rumbling noises reverberating through the halls. Aldrich stopped in his tracks, his heart racing as the realization settled in. It was no longer just the wolves. It was all of them. The animals in the reserve were no longer merely acting out of instinct. They were working together. They were organizing. And they were no longer afraid of him. Aldrich's thoughts raced. He had built this reserve to be a symbol of his control, a place where nature bent to his will. But now, it seemed that the reserve was no longer his. The animals had become something else, something that defied explanation. Something that could not be controlled. The moonlight filtered through the tall windows of the manor, casting eerie shadows across the floor. Aldrich stood still, listening to the growing cacophony from the reserve. The wolves, the lynxes, the boars, and the bears, they were all calling out, their voices rising in unison. The sound was not the call of wild creatures, but the call of something far more terrifying. It was the sound of rebellion. And it was coming from every corner of the reserve. Aldrich knew, with a certainty that he could not deny, that he had lost control. He had thought he could tame the land, that he could shape it into his own image, but he was wrong. The reserve, the animals, and the land itself were no longer his to command. They were beyond him, beyond his understanding. And as the sounds of the beasts continued to rise, Aldrich realized that something far more ancient, far more powerful than anything he had ever known, was stirring deep within the earth, something that would not be silenced, something that would not be controlled. The ground beneath his feet felt as though it was trembling, the very earth shifting as if to remind him of his place. He had tried to conquer nature, to bend it to his will, but now nature was turning on him, and the consequences would be more dire than he could ever have imagined. It was no longer just the animals. It was the land itself that had rebelled, and Aldrich, the once mighty lord of Ilverwick, was powerless to stop it. The days following the night of the howls were filled with an oppressive sense of inevitability, as though the very fabric of Ilverwick was being unraveled by some unseen force. Aldrich, though a man of formidable will, could not ignore the gnawing fear that had taken root deep in his chest. The estate, once a symbol of his dominion over nature, now seemed to reflect the darkness that had begun to seep into his own soul. The reserve was no longer the hunting ground of his ambition, nor the sanctuary of his triumphs. It had become something else entirely, a realm of chaos, where the very laws of nature were twisted and distorted in ways that defied explanation. Aldrich tried, in his usual manner, to regain control. He called in his most trusted men, the soldiers, the hunters, and the overseers, to deal with the growing threat within the reserve. They would enter the boundaries, he ordered, with the full force of the estate's power, and restore order to the land. His men, though loyal to him, began to show signs of doubt. Even the most hardened soldiers, who had faced countless battles and dangers, now spoke in hushed tones of a malevolent force that had taken hold of the estate. Their eyes betrayed their fear, and their bodies seemed to move with a heaviness that was not entirely their own. It became clear to Aldrich that the reserve was not merely a place of wild animals. It had become a battleground, a place where nature itself was fighting back against the tyranny of human intervention. And the creatures within, once his subjects, now his adversaries, were no longer acting as mere beasts. They were organized, intelligent, and increasingly violent. The wolves, no longer the obedient animals that had once answered his commands, now moved as a pack, hunting together with terrifying precision. The lynxes, once solitary and elusive, had started to exhibit a pack mentality, moving in groups and stalking their prey with an eerie sense of coordination. The boars, once docile creatures of the wild, had become predators in their own right, charging at anything that came too close. And the bears had become something out of legend, no longer merely the brute force of nature, but creatures of ferocity and rage, their eyes glowing with a primal fury. Aldrich was not accustomed to being defied. His entire life had been built on a foundation of control and dominance, over both men and nature. The creatures in the reserve, the land itself, had always bent to his will. But now, the tables had turned, and he found himself facing an enemy he could not understand, a force older and more powerful than anything he had ever encountered. The very ground beneath his feet seemed to tremble with an unseen power, and the air around him felt thick, as though it were charged with an electric current that only he could feel. Despite his mounting fear, Aldrich refused to acknowledge the full extent of the crisis. To do so would be to admit that his power, his control over the land, was slipping away. Instead, he clung to the belief that he could regain his authority, that with enough force, enough violence, he could suppress whatever dark force had taken root in the reserve. But his resolve was faltering. The land had become alien to him, and no amount of human intervention seemed to have any lasting effect. As the days passed, the strange occurrences became more frequent. The howls of the wolves grew louder and more urgent, their calls now echoing across the entire estate. It was as though they were calling to something that was not yet visible, but whose presence could be felt in the very air. The lynxes, too, began to act in ways that defied their nature. They would no longer allow themselves to be trapped or confined. They had become more elusive, slipping through the cracks of their enclosures with unnerving ease, moving through the trees and underbrush like shadows, too quick and too smart to be captured. The boars, once driven by the simple instincts of hunger and territory, now hunted with a purpose, charging at the soldiers and the estate's workers with savage fury. And the bears, those once mighty creatures, had become possessed by something darker. Their growls were deeper, their eyes glowing with a fierce intelligence that was impossible to ignore. But it wasn't just the animals. The reserve itself had become an oppressive force. The trees, once proud and strong, now seemed twisted and contorted, their bark dark and cracked, as if the very essence of the forest had been corrupted. The ground beneath Aldrich's feet felt unstable, as though the earth itself was shifting in response to the chaos around him. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the once familiar sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, the whispering of the wind, had been replaced by a hollow silence, broken only by the strange, primal sounds of the beasts that roamed the land. In an attempt to regain some measure of control, Aldrich ordered the construction of higher fences, stronger cages, and more secure enclosures for the animals. But each time his men completed one of these projects, the animals would break free or destroy the structures with a violent force that was beyond anything they had ever known. The wolves would tear through the fences with ease, their claws raking through the wood like it was paper. The lynxes, small but lethal, would slip through the tightest of spaces, their lithe bodies too agile for the human-made barriers. The boars would charge through anything in their path, their tusks ripping apart anything that stood in their way. The bears, with their immense strength, would tear through the reinforced steel bars of their enclosures as if they were nothing more than twigs. As Aldrich's frustration mounted, he began to lash out at his men, his temper growing darker with each passing day. His once imposing presence now seemed diminished, as if the power he had once commanded was slipping through his fingers. He had built his entire life on the idea that he could control everything, from the animals to the very land itself. But now, it was clear that the reserve, and the creatures within it, were no longer his to control. The villagers, too, had begun to notice the changes in the estate. They no longer spoke of the estate with awe or fear. Instead, they spoke in hushed tones of a curse that had befallen Ilverwick, of a power that had turned against its master. Even the most devout of the villagers, those who had once looked to Father Dunstan for comfort and guidance, now began to question their faith. They wondered if the ancient spirits of the forest had awakened, if the very land had turned against Lord Aldrich for disturbing the natural order. Some spoke of the old legends, of the spirits that had once ruled the land, of the darkness that lay hidden beneath the earth, waiting for the right moment to rise. Father Dunstan, too, could no longer ignore the signs. The priest had spent years trying to offer solace to the people of Ilverwick, to provide them with answers in the face of their fears. But now, even he was uncertain. The darkness that had descended upon the estate was unlike anything he had ever encountered. It was as though the very forces of nature had been corrupted, twisted into something darker. Father Dunstan began to wonder if his prayers, his faith, were enough to fight back against the ancient forces that were awakening in the reserve. But even he knew that he was powerless in the face of such a profound and malevolent force. As the tension grew, so too did the sense of isolation within the estate. Aldrich, once surrounded by servants, soldiers, and overseers, now found himself increasingly alone. The servants no longer ventured into the reserve, too afraid of the creatures that lurked within. The soldiers, once loyal and steadfast, now whispered of things that were beyond their comprehension. The estate itself seemed to close in on him, its walls pressing down on him, the land itself resisting his every move. It was as though Aldrich was being consumed by the very empire he had worked so hard to build, trapped in a world that no longer recognized his authority. Despite the mounting fear and the increasingly erratic behavior of the animals, Aldrich refused to leave the estate. He had built Ilverwick, had invested every ounce of his power into making it a symbol of his dominion over the natural world. He could not abandon it, not now. But the longer he stayed, the more he felt the weight of his own isolation. The land that had once been his to command had turned against him. The animals, once tame and obedient, had become something far more dangerous, far more elusive. And as the days wore on, Aldrich began to wonder if there was any escape from the dark forces that had awakened in the reserve. Would he ever regain control of his estate, or had he, in his quest for dominance, sealed his own fate? The questions haunted him, gnawed at him as he walked the halls of his manor, a man who had once been invincible, now trapped in a world of his own making. The reserve, with its twisted trees and restless creatures, had become a mirror of his own downfall. The power he had once wielded with such certainty had now become a burden, one that he could no longer carry. And as the sounds of the animals echoed through the night, Aldrich realized that the land had won. It had reclaimed what had always been its own. And he, the master of Ilverwick, was now its prisoner. It was in the final days of Aldrich's control that the estate seemed to close in around him with a suffocating finality. The eerie stillness that had long hung over Ilverwick now seemed to be punctuated by an almost tangible sense of impending collapse, a feeling that the land itself was drawing its last breaths. The creatures that had once been his prize, his subjects to command, now acted in ways that defied all reason and understanding. The wolves, whose loyalty had once been unwavering, no longer came when called. They stalked the perimeter of the reserve in large, coordinated packs, their eyes gleaming with a strange, almost human intelligence. The boars, once brutish and solitary, now moved as a single unit, charging at anything that dared to approach. The lynxes, with their slinking, predatory grace, had abandoned their solitary nature, now hunting together as though they shared a collective mind. And the bears, they had become something far beyond the brute force that Aldrich had once known. Their growls reverberated in the air, deep and menacing, like thunder in the distance, and their massive forms moved with a purpose that was alien to Aldrich. In the midst of this growing chaos, Aldrich's attempts to control the reserve seemed increasingly futile. The new enclosures he had commissioned were torn apart within days, the animals finding ways to escape and destroy whatever barriers had been put in place. The soldiers he had once relied on for their strength and loyalty now moved with hesitation, their faces pale and drawn, their resolve shaken by the violence and unpredictability of the beasts they were meant to control. The reserve had become a war zone, a place where the creatures of the wild were no longer subjugated but had become masters of their domain. And Aldrich, once the unquestioned ruler of it all, was now a prisoner of his own creation. Each day, the sense of isolation grew more unbearable. The servants, once dutiful and faithful, now avoided the estate altogether. They no longer dared to venture into the reserve, and many had quietly slipped away during the night, leaving only a handful behind. The soldiers, too, began to ask questions that Aldrich had no answers for. They spoke of a curse, of ancient forces that had awakened beneath the land, forces that were beyond the reach of human power. But Aldrich refused to entertain such notions. He had spent his entire life defying the laws of nature, bending them to his will. The idea that he, a man of reason and control, could be undone by something as vague and intangible as a curse was something he could not, would not, accept. He would not let the land defeat him. Not now. Not after all he had worked for. But with each passing day, his certainty wavered. His mind, once sharp and unyielding, now felt clouded and heavy. The strange occurrences had escalated to the point where he could no longer deny the supernatural forces at play. It wasn't just the animals anymore. It was the land itself, the very earth beneath his feet, that seemed to be working against him. The trees, once proud and stately, had begun to wither, their bark twisted and gnarled, their leaves a sickly yellow. The once pristine streams that ran through the reserve had turned dark, their waters thick with an oily film that stained the surrounding rocks. Even the air had changed. It felt heavier now, oppressive, as though it were laden with some unseen weight, a weight that pressed down on Aldrich's chest, making each breath harder to draw. The reserve, which had once been a symbol of his power and control, had become a dark mirror of his own unraveling. As the days stretched into weeks, the isolation that Aldrich felt grew unbearable. The manor, once filled with the bustle of servants, soldiers, and guests, had become eerily quiet. The whispers of the villagers had reached a fever pitch, and it was now impossible for Aldrich to ignore the growing belief among them that the land had turned against him. Father Dunstan, who had once been a faithful servant of God, had grown increasingly worried about the estate's fate. The priest had become a man of few words, his once comforting sermons now filled with a sense of dread that echoed in the hearts of his congregation. He, too, had come to believe that the forces at play within the reserve were far beyond the realm of human comprehension. And yet, despite his own growing fears, he continued to pray for Aldrich's soul, praying that the Lord of Ilverwick would somehow find redemption before it was too late. In the midst of the chaos, Aldrich made one final attempt to regain control. He summoned his most trusted soldiers, including Balthazar, the head huntsman, and ordered them to take one last stand in the reserve. They would hunt down the creatures that had risen up against them, and they would restore order, no matter the cost. Aldrich's voice, once commanding and firm, now trembled with the weight of his uncertainty, but he pressed on, unwilling to admit the true depths of his fear. The soldiers, hesitant but loyal, prepared for the hunt. They sharpened their weapons, donned their armor, and set out into the reserve under the cover of darkness. The full moon cast a pale light over the trees, which seemed to loom over them like silent sentinels, watching with a malevolent presence. The air was thick with tension, and the sound of their footsteps was muffled by the thick underbrush that had grown wild in recent weeks. As they ventured deeper into the reserve, the soldiers began to notice something unsettling. The usual sounds of the forest were absent. There were no chirping crickets, no rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was as though the entire forest had fallen silent in anticipation. The only sound was the heavy breathing of the men, and the creaking of the trees as if the land itself were shuddering. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, until it felt as though they were walking through a dark tunnel, the walls closing in on them from all sides. They came upon the first sign of the beasts. It was a fresh kill, a carcass torn apart with such ferocity that even the hardened soldiers recoiled. The body of a deer, its flesh shredded, its bones crushed beneath the weight of the predator's assault, lay in the center of the clearing. But it wasn't just the violence of the kill that disturbed the men. It was the fact that the animal's death seemed to have been no accident. The remains were arranged in a pattern, a deliberate, almost ritualistic arrangement that sent a chill down the spines of the soldiers. They had seen the handiwork of the beasts before, but this was different. This was something far more sinister. Balthazar, his face grim, ordered the men to move on. But as they pushed deeper into the heart of the reserve, the creatures began to show themselves. First, it was the wolves, their eyes glowing in the darkness, their teeth bared in a menacing snarl. But they did not attack immediately. Instead, they circled the men, moving with unsettling coordination, as though they were studying them, waiting for the right moment to strike. The soldiers raised their weapons, but it was clear that the wolves were not afraid. They had become something else, something more than mere animals. Their movements were calculated, their eyes filled with a sense of purpose that seemed almost unnatural. It was as if they were waiting for a command that did not come from Aldrich, but from some deeper, primal force that had taken hold of the reserve.